public is fixated on the wrong threat vector. The narrative sold is one of hypersonic missiles and advanced interceptors, a kinetic spectacle. This is a deliberate misdirection. According to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, even the architects of missile defense systems have long understood their fundamental limitations. The focus on launch signatures and warhead trajectories is a multi-trillion-dollar distraction from the true vulnerability. The decisive first strike in a peer-level conflict will not be an explosion. It will be silence. The primary target is not a city. It is the global nervous system. Analysts at RUSI confirm the strategic calculus, severing a few key undersea fiber optic cables, the conduits for over 95% of all internet traffic and trillions in daily financial transactions, achieve systemic paralysis at a fraction of the kinetic cost. Simultaneously, the second vector targets the optic nerve, satellite blinding. Low-orbit assets responsible for GPS, ISR, and secure communications are rendered inert not by missiles, but by directed energy or co-orbital attacks. This is not asset destruction. It is strategic castration. It removes the state's ability to see, to target, to communicate. It forces a systemic reversion to a launch-on-warning protocol, where ambiguity is met with annihilation. This creates the blind Leviathan, a superpower stripped of its information dominance and facing a systemic solvency crisis from unsustainable domestic debt, cannot absorb a conventional first strike. It has lost the economic capacity for protracted conflict, evidenced by proposals to seize foreign assets like Venezuelan oil, which face immense hurdles. With its eyes and ears gone, the state is left with a single, economically viable response. It becomes a cornered, sightless giant with only one tool left, the nuclear trigger. The motive is not aggression. It is insolvency. A state with systemic domestic liabilities, evidenced by unsustainable household debt levels reported in the Boston Herald, cannot afford the kinetic cost of conventional power projection. The blueprint for seizing and revitalizing foreign assets, such as the strategy proposed for Venezuela's oil industry, is now economically non-viable. The balance sheet is broken. This is a solvency crisis. When a state's economic base can no longer support its expeditionary military, it does not de-escalate. It pivots. Authoritative analysis from CSIS regarding Russia's strategic posture confirms this protocol. Domestic liability and the high cost of an unpopular conventional war forced a pivot. They compensated for conventional weakness by leveraging the asymmetric threat of their nuclear arsenal. This is not a theory. It is a documented strategic response to economic failure. This is the mathematical necessity forcing the current strategic realignment. Unable to project power through conventional means without triggering economic collapse, the state must find a cheaper, more potent vector. The only vector that provides global leverage without requiring a solvent economic base is the nuclear domain. It is a shift from expensive kinetic action to cost-effective strategic coercion. The evidence for this pivot is not hidden. It is a matter of public record. The Department of Energy's recent award of $2.7 billion for domestic uranium enrichment, with companies like Centrus Energy receiving contracts up to $900 million, is the receipt. This is not an energy initiative. It is a calculated overinvestment in the foundational material for nuclear power projection. Capital is being systematically diverted from insolvent conventional platforms to the only solvent vector remaining. The core motive is now clear. Internal economic weakness is being directly converted into external systemic risk. The state is not choosing this path out of malice, but out of the cold logic of a solvency crisis. Weakness forces the pivot to asymmetry. The unsustainable debt at home is now the primary accelerant for nuclear risk abroad. The kinetic cost of projecting conventional power has inverted. A state-of-the-art battle tank, a $5 million asset representing national industrial might, can now be systematically liquidated by a $500 first-person view drone. This is not warfare. It is an economic annihilation. The return on investment for symmetric violence has collapsed to zero and then gone negative. This 10,000 to 1 cost disparity is not a battlefield anomaly. It's a structural feature of modern conflict, a data point confirmed by analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. This asymmetric cost vector renders large-scale conventional deployments economically insolvent before the first shot is fired. The solvency crisis is no longer confined to domestic liabilities. It is now the primary constraint on military strategy. The system can no longer afford to fight a peer on its own terms. This economic inversion triggers a protocol shift known as the democratization of violence. The financial barrier to entry for strategic, kinetic impact has effectively been erased. Power is decoupled from industrial base and economic scale. When the state's balance sheet cannot sustain symmetric conflict, its only remaining move is to pivot to a vector where cost is irrelevant. This is the mathematical certainty driving the overinvestment in the nuclear domain. Regional instability is not an accident. Travel warnings from allied governments concerning nations like South Africa or even Canada are not random noise, they are signals. These regions are being designated as gray zones, proxy laboratories for strategic testing. The era of solvent conventional intervention is over. The documented hurdles in plans to seize and revitalize assets like Venezuela's oil industry prove the kinetic cost is now an unacceptable economic liability. Within these gray zones, new protocols are staged. Economic warfare, logistical stress tests, political subversion, all can be deployed below the threshold of a formal military response. According to RUSI, this is a calculated blueprint for achieving strategic leverage without the capital outlay of conventional force. The state's capacity for kinetic power projection is anchored to the seafloor by systemic domestic liabilities, specifically unsustainable household debt, as documented by economic analysts. These proxy theaters, however, are merely the staging ground for symptoms. The root cause is the solvency crisis at the core of the system. When a state can no longer afford to project power, it does not de-escalate. As a matter of mathematical certainty, it is forced to pivot to asymmetric escalation. This is not a policy choice. It is a function of economic gravity. This is the asymmetric pivot. CSIS analyses confirm a systemic overinvestment into domains offering maximum leverage for minimum cost. The Department of Energy's $2.7 billion domestic uranium enrichment initiative, including the $900 million HALEU production award to Centrus Energy, is the primary evidence. This is not an energy policy. It is the direct conversion of internal economic weakness into external systemic nuclear risk. The gray zone is the laboratory. The nuclear vector is the weapon. The nuclear command protocol known as Launch on Warning is not a relic of the Cold War. It is the state's current, active response to its own insolvency. The doctrine is brutally simple. Strategic analysts at RUSI define it as a protocol to launch a full-scale retaliatory strike upon receiving sensor data indicating an inbound enemy attack, but before that attack has landed and detonated. The objective is to ensure your assets are not destroyed in their silos. The system requires absolute faith in the data. This introduces the fog of digital war. A sophisticated cyber attack does not need to kinetically strike a target. It only needs to blind the early warning radar network. It spoofs the data, creating phantom launches, or, more critically, creating a total information blackout. In that moment of blindness, The commander has two choices. Option 1. Assume it's a glitch, wait for confirmation, and risk the complete annihilation of your nuclear forces if the attack is real. Option 2. Follow protocol and launch, because the absence of data is interpreted as the decapitation of your command structure. The commander is forced to launch out of fear. This is not a human failure, it is a systemic feature. When a state can no longer afford the kinetic cost of conventional power projection due to systemic domestic liabilities, it must leverage cheaper, asymmetric vectors. The nuclear arsenal is the ultimate asymmetric tool. The recent multi-billion-dollar investment into domestic uranium enrichment, confirmed by the Department of Energy's awards to firms like Centrus Energy, is not for power plants. It is the financial receipt for this strategic pivot. It is the recapitalization of the one weapon system that projects power without a solvent economic base. Therefore, a cyber attack is now a nuclear tripwire. Internal economic weakness, a solvency crisis driven by unsustainable debt, has been directly converted into external systemic nuclear risk. The less capable the state is of funding a conventional war, the more sensitive its nuclear trigger must become. This is a mathematical certainty. The launch protocol is the final backstop for a nation that can no longer afford any other option. The shift from conventional to asymmetric escalation is not a choice. It is a mathematical function of national insolvency. With domestic liabilities exceeding sustainable thresholds, as documented by sources like the Boston Herald, the kinetic cost of traditional power projection, such as the complex scenarios for seizing foreign oil assets, has become prohibitive. The state apparatus, facing a solvency crisis, is forced to divest from expensive kinetic platforms and reroute capital into vectors with the highest leverage. This is not theory, it is accounting. The multi-billion-dollar domestic uranium enrichment contract awarded to Centrus is the receipt. It proves the thesis. The only remaining solvent vector for power projection is the nuclear threat. This strategic pivot necessitates a new protocol for testing adversary response without triggering a full-spectrum conflict. In this new doctrine, outlined in CSIS and RUSI wargames, a calibration shot is required. It is a limited, non-kinetic strike on critical economic infrastructure, engineered for plausible deniability. The objective is not destruction, but data collection, to measure the target's political will, detection capabilities, and response thresholds in a live environment. It is the modern equivalent of a shot across the bow, updated for an era of economic warfare. Therefore, the calibration forecast is as follows. Within the next 12 months, expect a catastrophic, attribution impossible systems. Failure at a Tier 1 American energy export terminal. The digital lockdown of crane operations and shipping manifests will paralyze a critical port for 48 to 72 hours. The event will be officially attributed to a sophisticated ransomware attack or a catastrophic server farm glitch. It will not be an act of war. It will be an economic calculation. It is a message, sent at the cost of a few lines of code, to demonstrate the leverage an adversary holds over a nation that can no longer afford to patrol the seas, but is doubling down on the atom.